Michael, can you please describe in layman's terms what is the actual process of a formal tarot reading? What is the dynamics between the reader, the person getting the reading, and the cards themselves? What is involved in a tarot reading?
Well, this is what we go into on the Mystery School in great detail. You can either do it in a very loose way, for fun, which is a great way to start. You can do it in a much more reverent way in which you kind of start doing readings for yourself. Or you can, dive in there and say, I really want to end up doing this professionally as a form of therapy, and think in terms of seeing clients. We have some people in the Mystery School that want to do that. So there's all sorts of different ways. And in my system, I don't really focus that much on the Celtic cross spread and some of the other spreads that, I don't think they have a lot of, again, it's a personal choice, but I try to make, we were talking about numbers, right? And about how these numbers crop up importantly throughout these divination arts. And that's what I try to do. I try to stick with that format, so that the spreads already have a kind of sacred something in them. You know what I mean? Like the Trinity spread or the Quaternity spread. We have a relationship spread of 9 cards, and then the Zodiac, and then also a Kabbalistic, and I use 11 zones on the Kabbalistic spread that we use in the Mystery School, again, because of the sacredness of that number. Because once you keep using the numbers that are inherent within these arts, then it just means that the answers are clearer, and you can trust them more. So on one level, like you mentioned just before the break there, it's about sitting with them. Instead of doing any predictive stuff, these things can be used for so much more than that. They're not partly, but one of the biggest things that they're for is to open dialogue with the inner zodiac, or in more layman's terms, to start massaging the right side of the brain, in which there's a kind of thinking that we're no longer using, and I'll be alluding to this through the whole series about this kind of thinking, this archetypal thinking, which is now, falling by the wayside. This kind of Heilig, theosophical mode of thinking is under attack in our modern world. So the tarot is definitely about psychic hygiene. It's about keeping things close to you so that you're in your meditations on the cards, or just, again, playing with them lightly in a sort of a playful way. There's a certain healing that happens. Then you take it to the next step, as it becomes more serious, when it becomes more mantic, when you are now looking for to use them to enlighten yourself, to move into this Heilig state of consciousness, as opposed to, say, the more hedonic. Like I've said many times, that most people in today's world are recreational. That makes up for almost 80% of the people. Then people have occupational, and that's where they usually stop. If you've gone to college and then you've got a degree and you go get a job, if it's a journalist or whatever, that's it. And for most people, that takes care of most of their life. And when they're not doing their occupation, they're recreating. They're playing basketball or doing something on that. Again, these are hedonic. This is all people of the hedonic level who never stop and ask. In other words, they don't look into that mirror of the self. They don't question themselves philosophically or what's going on or any of that. And so that's okay. But for those few people who do start asking those questions, now there's a lot of traps. Because, as I said, now you can get lost in some sort of Eastern mysticism and philosophy and all this other, there's a lot of ways to get lost in cults and sects and spurious religions and guru worship and all. So the man and the woman who open up to these higher subjects is now very, very vulnerable. It's almost like you can understand why they made the Fool the first card, because, my God, you really are at a precipice, ready to be swallowed, But I can advise those people that this Western magical tradition that involves the tarot and astrology and Kabbalah numerology, you're on safe ground, as long as you are a person of integrity. Now, if you bring other things to it, well, that's a whole other story, But in practical purposes, there is this level where various, in my system, we do various charts. We can even do various spreads. anyone who knows my time gnosis system knows that I'm not into prediction in that conventional sense, like some sort of crystal ball gazing, and in which you're telling people, oh, is this guy the right guy for me? Is this girl the right girl for me? And you have this idea, on the street, people have this idea that, a clairvoyant sort of looks into the future and then says, yes, he's the right, this kind of thing, like it's sort of prediction, how things are going to come out or whatever. And of course, my work is to show that this is utterly spurious. It's as spurious as this idea that rocks floating in space affect consciousness, which most astrologers believe. This is all nonsense. And also this concept of prediction. As a matter of fact, as anyone who studied my time gnosis system will see, even if they've only glanced at the website and seen some of the facts we have there, they'll know that my entire system is based in the timing that a thing occurs. Now this helps shift the dial, shift the center of gravity from this concept of woo-woo, sort of looking into the future and peering as if there's some clairvoyance involved in this. I don't believe that that's legitimate. But that doesn't mean that the divination arts now can be thrown into the dumpster, as all these materialist atheists would just love to do, right? These skeptics. No. As a matter of fact, my system reinstates these subjects, but in a way that corresponds to the latest discoveries of the quantum scientists and what have you, that actually links it deeply to the more coherent understandings of how the universe works. And to make it short, like we do on the Time Gnosis website, the whole concept is that in the timing when a thing happens to you, like you meet this person, right? The phone rings with this opportunity. Oh, you saw this job application in the newspaper. Or you had this idea pop into your head. Absolutely, at the very moment that occurred is the secret of whether it's good, bad, or in between for you. And therefore, the writing down of those dates, I meet somebody and they tell me, hey, do you think I should invest in this project, or whatever? I just know by the very moment and the time that idea came in, that I was offered that opportunity. I don't need to be thinking even later, about whether it's going to come right or come wrong. I immediately know that what day did this opportunity come to me? And then I am able to decode that through what is known as the personal timeline, right? And the tarot has a very big meaning in how you unpack that. It's part of the decoding method. You can decode astrologically, you can decode numerologically, which is what time gnosis is about. But you can also decode using the tarot. So the applications are actually freaking endless, and so I go more towards that. So what I'm really trying to say is that in my approach to the divination arts, all the fat of the woo-woo shit is just carved away, whether it's rocks floating in space or this predictive nonsense, and I keep it to the most practical. That means that the person only has to digest the system, apply it one time in their life, and in that very week they're going to know that they've just moved into a holy place, because they're going to see it immediately in their life. That's what my systems are all about. Making it so practical that a person who's genuine in 1 week of using the system is going to immediately see, oh my God, what the hell is this? And you're going to be, you're going to have a different set of navigators. You're going to have a different map. You're going to have a different confidence on the oceans of life because of these systems. Now, believe me, it took a long time to get to this system. A lot of stuff had to be carved away, a lot of nonsense. I'm making it kind of brief, but this was, over 20, 30-year period. You and I talked about a bit of that journey on the last interview, but now it's done. It's pristine, and I didn't want to, in the Path of the Fool book, I just put the meanings of the cards. There's no symbolism in that because I knew I was going to do this series, free series, where I'll deal with the symbolism in a separate project. It's no good to, smear them together. It's too, the beautiful practical meanings of the cards need to be kept pristine. That's a book of its own. I didn't bung in all of the esoteric, abstract stuff that we're doing in the Path of the Fool because I wanted to do that in a video form, and Chris agreed, rather than to do that in book form. So people were a bit confused and say, oh yeah, what are you doing? But I know what I'm doing. I know I've studied this for years, and the best way to get the modern mind into the subject is to make them as practical as possible so that they can immediately see the benefit. So in my spread readings that I teach on the Mystery School, immediately you can apply them to your relationships, to the forthcoming opportunities that you have, to this, like I said, more time gnosis based system in which from now on, when a thing happens to you, all you got to know is the day and the date, and you're clued in. You know exactly from now on for the rest of your life whether anything any person, any idea is good, bad, or indifferent to you. Now, that is the maximum empowerment that anyone could ever derive from any magical system, from any worldly system, from any clock, from any timepiece, from any machinery that you can create, be it esoteric machinery or exoteric machinery. That is the best that anything could ever offer you. And that's why it's a synthesis of lots of different systems, but it's rooted in the practicality. So it's not woo-woo, it's not anything that is just only abstract. It must be, because I have a belief that although a man's head must be in the stars, his feet must be on the ground. You have to have the practical as well as the divine. Otherwise, it doesn't work. The four worlds of the Kabbalist, the four objects that the magician has on his table. One of them is the pentacle. One of them is the disc. That's the earth plane. And by the way, just in case people are confused, Aleister Crowley's deck calls those the discs. And he's better to call it that because the word pentacle is wrong. It's erroneous. The word, and sometimes you even see, and they make this mistake on the Rider-Waite deck where they actually show you 5-pointed stars on the pentacles. Now, this is completely erroneous. The word pentacle is a misattribution. The actual word for that suit was pantacle, P-A-N-T-L. Right? So, and pantacle simply meant a plate or a disc or something flat. It had nothing to do with the word pentacle at all. So this is a mistake in the tarot, okay? So the discs, or the pantacle, a pantacle meant a plate, a flat disc, and it represented the earth plane. It represented the stone of Fal in the Celtic tradition. As I said, in the pre-Celtic Ireland, they had the 4 treasures, which represented the 4 suits of the tarot. The wand of Lu, the sword of Nada, the cauldron of the Dagda, the god called the Dagda in pre-Celtic mythology, and then this stone of Fal that belonged to Manannán mac Lir, an important deity. In fact, the Isle of Man in Britain is named after that god. So these were the 4 treasures of Ireland. And just to emphasize the point, there's a lot of little, inconsistencies and errors. Sometimes I make them myself in the series, and when I do that, I write below in the area below in the YouTube, in the comment section, I'll correct myself if I make a little fluff, on something, which I've done a couple of times. I'll make sure that that's corrected. But people then are welcome to, write to me and email and ask deeper questions if they wish to, and I can put them on to sources, And I encourage people absolutely on whatever level, whether it's a simplistic level of just messing with the cards and looking at them and taking them out and browsing them and seeing these little connections and asking questions about the cards, why is this guy walking away from these cups, and why is this other, why is this guy hanging upside down from a tree, and all this kind of thing. Just ask simple questions without necessarily wanting the answers, because these things are awakening that archive of knowledge that I spoke about, that I refer to as the inner oracle or the inner zodiac. Working with the tarot is better than working with astrology, better than working even with numerology, because it incorporates images, and images is the right brain and the deeper ancestral brain. And that's the stuff that our Western Faustian hyper-rational kind of thinking and institutions of thought do not want you working with, okay? They do not want you we've spoken so many times about how much this ancient symbolism, there it is again at the end of the Lord's Prayer, Amen. What is an Egyptian word? Some people think it has to do with Amen Ra. It actually doesn't. It's a word for the moon, actually. Men, M-E-N, is the ancient word for the moon. The Phrygian, god of the moon, and it was called Men. And that's where you get the Greek Endymion, right? The god of the moon, Endymion. There's that at the end of the word of the gods. Endymion is the Amion. And it's said at the end of prayers in Christianity, not because it's so much of a solar appellation, but because it relates to the inner light of God. So you say Amen because it's the lunar light. And as I explained, people miss this so many times when they think of the light of the moon and the light of the sun. Simply that goddess light. There's nothing evil or mysterious about it. The lunar light is the internal cold light of the mind, of the soul. So when you say Amen at the end of the prayer, it's not the solar light, it's the inner light, because it's within, right, that this process of enlightenment takes place. God speaks within you. You are the temple of God. You know, so this feminine light just simply represented that. It represented the light of cognition, the light of the internal landscape. You get to see this in card 18 as well, and some other cards as well. And then there's this solar light that rules our working in the daily, you know, our workings between each other, our movements in the world, our worldly aspirations and creations and all of that. There's two different kinds of light. This was understood to the ancients. They may have even had more kinds of light, but this one they certainly understood. And in the ancient world, there was a thing called homonymism, which is you couldn't have the zodiac without it. Homonymism is when you personify a human trait by some animal behavior or even some inanimate behavior, right? That's why the ram was known for its strength, the lion for its majesty, you know, its pride, and all of these things that you'd look to in the world of nature, you know, to the insects and the ape. I had a discussion with somebody about the symbolism of why Thoth was also, you know, the god Thoth was also personified as an ape, and the leopard, and then the praying mantis, and all of these animals that were from ancient times observed by the human race, then became personifications. And that's what the zodiac was, you know, that all of these different traits, like I said in the priestess, the trait of being able to keep your own self private, to be discreet, to be surreptitious, to be clandestine, you know, to be circumspect. These are human traits, but then we could pick animals, you see, that may have represented that. Night animals and so on, or secretive little animals that, you know, you don't first notice. And so it goes with the whole ancient world of how they operated by using nature, by so deeply basing the human creations and the human endeavors on what nature was instructing us to do. As I said, again, you know, that's in our racial memory, but we've basically forgotten it on a conscious level.